began like a thriller, billions of euros negotiated via private text messages between Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, and Albert B., the CEO of Pfizer, without tendering procedures, without public oversight, and without any transparency. At a time when the EU claims to be the bastion of democracy and public accountability, the opposite is now being revealed. These crucial SMS messages concerning the largest vaccine purchases in the history of the Union have disappeared without explanation or processing. The Commission itself admits that the messages are not archived. No access, it says. This scandal is more than a technical problem. It is a political earthquake shaking the foundations of the European Union. 1.8 billion vaccine doses should have been acquired through transparent, fair negotiations. Instead, the deal was struck behind closed doors. Without the necessary public records or documentation, what initially appears as a minor incident in the administrative apparatus turns out to be a gigantic fiasco that shakes confidence in European institutions to their very core. Mutual agreements, dark channels, and secret negotiations. These shocking revelations make clear how deep the entanglements between the EU and large pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer go. And not only that, this incident is not isolated. Rumors of similar practices in other major transactions and contracts within the EU are circulating. It is an open secret that the EU has often failed to account for its decisions in the past. But the case of Ursula von der Leyen and Pfizer is a frightening symptom of an even deeper structural problem: corruption, secrecy, and lack of accountability. In this opaque situation, a crucial question arises: what will become of the trust of European citizens now? If decisions involving billions are made in this way, without the citizen receiving even a trace of how can one still believe in the integrity of the EU? Ursula von der Leyen, once celebrated as a guarantor of stability and transparency, now stands as a symbol of the crisis that threatens to tear Europe into the abyss. And what are those responsible in Brussels doing? Instead of creating transparency and clarification, the Commission continues to maintain its silence. Citizens and journalists who try to shed light on this scandal are confronted with the answer that the messages no longer exist, as if that would close the case. But this silence is a political signal that poses the greatest danger. It reinforces the impression that the EU is led by an elite that exercises its power without regard for the rights of citizens. And the longer this political wall of silence lasts, the deeper the public's trust sinks. The political crisis surrounding Ursula von der Leyen is taking on more dramatic proportions with each passing day. What began as initial criticism of the disappeared SMS has developed into an almost historic crisis that threatens not only her political career, but also the credibility of the entire European Commission. Ursula von der Leyen, who until recently was considered one of the most influential politicians in Europe, is now facing a political isolation that she would never have thought possible in her previous term of office. The criticism comes from all sides. Ursula von der Leyen was originally celebrated as a strong and trustworthy leader. She is now increasingly being questioned by former allies in the European Parliament and from her own political family, the European People's Party, EPP. What was considered strong support a few months ago has now turned into a loud silence. The pressure on von der Leyen is growing not only from the political opposition, but also from within her own ranks. More and more members of parliament, including those from her own party, are demanding consequences. The political motion of no confidence against Ursula von der Leyen has gained momentum. More than 70 members of parliament from various factions have joined this motion, and more political observers are certain that the political air is thinning for von der Leyen. What was unthinkable just a few months ago, such broad opposition within the EPP, is now a reality. Critics accuse her of not only acting intransparently, but also of pursuing a policy of concealment by withholding key information about vaccine purchases and secret negotiations. The scandal surrounding the disappeared SMS messages is no longer just an administrative problem, but a symbolic sign of the decline of transparency in the entire European Union. And while von der Leyen tries to brand her critics as political opponents and pass the responsibility on to others, the number of those who no longer want to stand behind her is growing. Even leading politicians in Berlin and Paris are conspicuously reserved when it comes to publicly supporting the president of the Commission. This silence from von der Leyen's most traditional supporters at a time when she needs more backing than ever is a loud signal. Her political isolation is growing not only within the EU but also in the national capitals. The big question now is, does Ursula von der Leyen still have the support she needs to weather this crisis? Or will she become a political hostage of her own intransparency and secrets? It is not only the loss of political support that endangers her, the entire credibility of the Commission is at stake if the EU continues to sink into such scandals and does nothing to inform the public or create transparency. It will not only lose the trust of its citizens, but also its political authority. The situation for Ursula von der Leyen is escalating increasingly. The political pressure on her is growing not only within the European Union, but also from the member states, which are increasingly having to deal with the consequences of her intransparent decisions. Especially in countries like Germany, France and Italy, people are asking the same questions. Why are billions of euros being spent in secret negotiations without the necessary public oversight? Why do important decisions about the health and well-being of EU citizens remain in the hands of a few who do not deal transparently with their actions? What at first seemed like an isolated problem within the Commission has now developed into one of the biggest political crises in the history of the EU. The citizens are outraged, and resistance is growing in the national parliaments. It is not only the opponents of Ursula von der Leyen who are rising up against her, but also from within her own ranks, especially within the EPP. A significant step in this escalation was the increasingly critical attitude of leading politicians from von der Leyen's home country Germany, who suddenly placed themselves in the front row of the critics. The big questions are being asked more loudly. How can it be that 1.8 billion vaccine doses were purchased through private channels and without the necessary public control? What happens to the taxpayers' money for which such billion-dollar deals are responsible? What has become of the EU's promises to act transparently and democratically? But the political situation is becoming even more explosive. The motion of no confidence against Ursula von der Leyen, which is already before Parliament, is gaining increasing support. This motion is supported not only by the opposition but also by members of Parliament from von der Leyen's own party, the EPP. This growing number of supporters shows that the pressure on the President of the Commission is coming not only from the outside but also from within. The political crisis she is triggering affects not only her own office but also the trust in the entire EU institution, which is now perceived by many as opaque and manipulated by large corporations. What is even more dramatic is that the reactions from the member states are becoming increasingly critical. In Romania, Poland and Hungary, countries that often oppose the central decisions of the EU, distrust of Ursula von der Leyen and her methods is growing. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, is using the opportunity to position himself as a dissenting voice to Brussels and to further fuel distrust of the EU. Orban and other politicians in Central and Eastern Europe see this crisis as an opportunity to further advance their own national agendas. It seems as if the scandal is not only becoming a political crisis to a societal challenge, but also taking on a geopolitical dimension. The political pressure that Ursula von der Leyen must experience is increasing, and the question of whether she is still able to retain her office is increasingly real. Her decision to play with the media and the members of parliament and continue to provide no clear answers only exacerbates the situation further. This silence and evasion is more dangerous than any scandalous statement, because it reinforces the impression that the political elite in Brussels has nothing to hide, and this at the expense of the citizens. The political crisis surrounding Ursula von der Leyen is reaching a dramatic climax. The motion of no confidence against the President of the European Commission has become a reality and could represent one of the biggest political upheavals in the history of the EU. What only a few months ago appeared as a marginal issue and only as an isolated concern has now developed into a serious political problem that threatens not only von der Leyen's political future but also the entire credibility of the EU institutions. The motion of no confidence has now gained broad support, with more than 70 members of parliament from various political factions, including within the EPP, joining the call to remove Ursula von der Leyen. This number continues to grow, which further fuels the political crisis. What initially began as partisan maneuvering in the European Parliament has developed into an overarching political movement that threatens to destroy the citizens' trust in the EU institutions. The motion is exceptional in many respects, as there have been few comparable cases in the history of the EU where the President of the Commission has faced a vote of no confidence. But the political pressure is growing increasingly, and von der Leyen herself is facing a historic crisis that affects not only her office, but shakes the foundation of the entire EU policy. The scandal surrounding the disappeared SMS messages and the secret vaccine negotiations has massively shaken the trust of European citizens. It is no longer just a question of lost communication, but a question of intransparency and abuse of power, which increasingly isolates the political elite of the EU. It is not only the lack of transparency that could bring Ursula von der Leyen down. The political handling of the scandal and the attempt to sweep everything under the rug has further weakened her position. Instead of clear answers or the willingness to take responsibility, the Commission has continued to block inquiries, refused to provide documentation, and hidden behind a wall of silence. This has further increased distrust and created the impression that the EU leadership not only places itself above the law, but also protects itself from public scrutiny. The escalation of the motion of no confidence has far-reaching consequences. It is not an ordinary motion. If the motion is actually successful in the European Parliament, this would represent a historic political turning point and sustainably change the balance of power within the EU. The motion of no confidence is not just a political measure against von der Leyen, but also a clear message to the European leadership. The citizens and the members of Parliament want more transparency and accountability. Although the motion of no confidence will probably fail, it has already shown how deep the divide between the EU elite and the citizens has become. Even in the capitals like Berlin and Paris, which used to provide support for Ursula von der Leyen, there is no clear signal of support anymore. This silence and this reticence speak volumes. Ursula von der Leyen is politically isolated like never before. The crucial question remains, however, can von der Leyen regain trust even if she survives the vote of no confidence? And if not, what follows then? Will the EU survive the political crisis, or will it be severely damaged by this episode? In any case, the outcome of this motion of no confidence will extend far beyond the future of von der Leyen and have profound political consequences for the entire EU. The political crisis surrounding Ursula von der Leyen is no longer just an internal conflict, but a symbolic reflection of the deep crisis of confidence that the European Union is experiencing. The revelations about disappeared SMS messages and secret vaccine negotiations have not only shaken confidence in von der Leyen, but have also shaken the foundation of the entire EU institutions. What was previously considered an untouchable power structure has now become a shaky house of cards. The loss of trust is far-reaching and affects not only the Commission but the credibility of all European institutions. The questions that citizens are now asking are no longer just theoretical. What happens to our tax money? Why is the truth being withheld from us? How much longer are we supposed to accept a system that is intransparent and unreliable? These questions are not only understandable, they are outrageous. Citizens who have believed in the stability and transparency of the EU for years feel betrayed. The EU's response in the form of silence and rejection of inquiries has reinforced the impression that the EU institutions are more interested in power and control than in the truth and the needs of their citizens. In many member states, especially in Germany, Italy and France, there is growing resentment about the actions of Ursula von der Leyen. These countries, which are traditionally considered the heart of the EU, are facing an ever-widening political gap between the Union and its citizens. The older generations, who have believed in the EU for decades, are now increasingly asking the question, how could it come to this? Their disappointment is palpable, and they demand answers that are still missing today. But this loss of trust goes beyond the words of the critics. Political decision-makers within the EU are also beginning to question the foundations of the Union. Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has taken this opportunity to further reinforce his stance towards the EU. With fiery rhetoric, he presents himself as an anti-Brussels figure who is fighting against the intransparency of the Union. His position is becoming increasingly popular, especially among citizens who hold the EU responsible for its ineffective crisis management. In this political stress test, it is becoming increasingly clear that the EU is facing a fundamental decision. Must it reinvent itself and give its citizens back their credibility? Or will it end as an elitist, secluded institution, an institution that has lost contact with the people and only serves the interests of large corporations and political elites? While Ursula von der Leyen continues to try to evade responsibility, the political pressure is growing. There are more and more demands from the parliaments, but also from the general public, to demand a fundamental change in the EU's leadership style. Will there be a reform, or will the EU continue to sink into a crisis characterized by a lack of accountability and intransparency? Part 6. The turning point for Europe. What comes after Ursula von der Leyen? Europe is at a crucial turning point. The scandal surrounding Ursula von der Leyen and the disappeared SMS messages has put trust in the European institutions to the test. But as the political crisis surrounding the President of the Commission continues, a crucial question becomes ever more pressing. Can Europe weather this storm? The question of the credibility and future of the EU institutions is more present today than ever before. The EU must decide whether it can accept the political, economic and social challenges or whether it will continue to remain in the misery that the past has created. It is obvious that Ursula von der Leyen and her Commission are burdened not only by the scandal, but by a deeper crisis of EU credibility. The citizens who had hoped for transparency and accountability feel increasingly betrayed. While the Commission continues to react with a wall of silence, the resistance is growing both within the institutions and outside, especially in the member states, where political dissatisfaction with the decisions made by Brussels is steadily increasing. The motion of no confidence, which is already on the table in the European Parliament, could trigger the biggest political crisis in the history of the EU. If this motion is successful, it would not only mean the end of Ursula von der Leyen's political career, but also usher in a radical upheaval in the leadership and structure of the EU. But even if she survives this vote of no confidence, her political existence could be permanently damaged as her leadership style and decisions continue to be questioned. In this uncertain political landscape, the importance of alternatives to the existing EU leadership is growing. Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has established himself in recent years as one of the loudest critics of Brussels. While Ursula von der Leyen and the EU Commission are increasingly sidelined, Orbán is becoming more and more confident and is perceived by a growing number of European citizens as a politician of the future, at least from the perspective of those who reject the centralized bureaucracy and the stalemate in Brussels. Orbán and other populists like Marine Le Pen in France are using the current crisis to strengthen their vision of a Europe of nations in which the sovereignty of the member states is once again paramount. This policy shift could change the European balance forever. What once seemed unthinkable, a collapse of the EU as a political and economic unit, could now become a realistic possibility if the EU is unable to regain the trust of the citizens. The path that Ursula von der Leyen and the other decision-makers in Brussels must take is clear. Either they succeed in reforming the EU and renewing their relations with the citizens, or they risk that the Union will disappear into political insignificance. But what happens if Ursula von der Leyen actually has to resign? What political consequences would that have for the EU institutions and their relations with the national governments? These questions have not yet been answered, but there is no question that the political pressure will continue to increase in the coming weeks and months. The storm that von der Leyen is trying to weather could prove insurmountable if she is not willing to ensure transparency and take responsibility. It is undeniable that the future of the European Union is at stake. The events of recent months have shown how quickly trust in the EU and its institutions can be lost. But even if the political crisis has serious consequences, it could also offer an opportunity for a necessary redesign of the EU. An opportunity to break free from old, inefficient structures and create a transparent, democratic union that meets the needs of its citizens. From the events surrounding Ursula von der Leyen, an important lesson can be learned about the necessity of political accountability and transparency in the decisions of political institutions. If important decisions are made without public oversight or information is withheld, this inevitably leads to a loss of trust. The scandal offers an opportunity for institutions to redefine themselves and act transparently in order to regain the trust of citizens. The power of citizens to demand accountability from political leaders is crucial for the stability and trust in democratic systems. This contribution is based on publicly available information and official court rulings, as well as reliable journalistic sources such as Reuters, Politico and Euronews. It serves for factual political analysis. Should a significant factual correction arise subsequently, this will be transparently provided. Our content does not pursue any partisan political goal and does not violate the YouTube guidelines on misinformation, errors in the presentation or community standards. The goal is to provide education and political classification, not to spread false claims.